Welcome to today's episode of Serial Killer Files. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of one of the most chilling serial killers in American history. A woman who used kindness as a weapon, compassion as camouflage, and a boarding house as a hunting ground. Picture this. November 11th, 1988. Sacramento, California. A tidy Victorian home at 1426. F Street stands quietly in the morning light. The garden is well kept, roses blooming despite the autumn chill. To neighbors, this is the home of a kindly older woman, a grandmother figure who takes in society's most vulnerable, the homeless, the mentally ill, the addicted. She cooks them meals. She helps them with their benefits. She's known as a compassionate soul. But on this particular morning, police detectives arrive at the front door. They're looking for a missing tenant, a 51-year-old man named Alvaro Montoya, known as Bert to his friends. He has a developmental disability and schizophrenia. His social worker, Judy Moyes, has been unable to reach him for weeks. The landlady has given contradictory excuses for his absence, and Moyes' instincts are screaming that something is terribly wrong. The detectives walk through the property, their eyes scanning the yard. Then they notice it. A patch of recently disturbed soil. When they ask the landlady about it, she remains remarkably calm. She shrugs. She says she doesn't know what's there. And then, in a gesture that would become infamous, she hands one of the detectives a shovel. Within minutes, the shovel strikes something. The detective uncovers a decomposing human body. It's Leona Carpenter, a 78-year-old former tenant. But this is just the beginning. Over the next several days, as forensic teams methodically excavate the property, they will uncover a total of 7 bodies buried in that yard. 7 people who came to 1426 F Street seeking shelter and found only death. The kindly landlady? Her name was Dorothea Puente, and she would become known as the House Landlady, one of Sacramento's most notorious serial killers. Before we dive deeper into this horrific tale, I need you to understand something crucial about Dorothea Puente. This wasn't a monster lurking in shadows. This wasn't someone who looked dangerous or acted suspiciously. Dorothea Puente was a slight, white-haired woman who wore vintage clothing and large glasses. She looked like everybody's grandmother, and that was exactly the point. Puente operated by crafting a deceptively perfect image of a caring, trustworthy older woman. She understood something dark and calculating about human nature. We want to trust people who look harmless. We want to believe that a grandmother tending to her rose garden is exactly what she appears to be. Puente weaponized that instinct. She specifically targeted tenants for her Sacramento boarding house who were elderly, mentally disabled, homeless, or struggling with addiction. But she didn't just target anyone in these vulnerable categories. She had specific selection criteria. She chose people without close family or strong social networks. People whose disappearances would be less likely to be noticed or investigated right away. People society had already begun to forget. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. Social workers were deceived by her kindly demeanor. They frequently referred their most difficult clients to her, actually believing they were placing these vulnerable people in safe hands. They saw a compassionate caretaker. They couldn't have been more wrong. Puente's public facade was meticulously maintained. She ran a well-kept home with that beautiful rose garden. She provided meals to her tenants. She had rules, no alcohol allowed, she said, which made her seem like a strict but reliable manager. This reassured social workers and authorities. She was even involved in charitable acts, hosting Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and helping people sign up for government benefits. But behind this elaborate theatrical performance was a cold, calculating predator whose sole motivation was money. Financial gain drove every action. With a long history of theft, forgery, and financial fraud, Puente had found the perfect scheme. She would forge her tenants' signatures on government checks. She would drug them with sleeping pills, particularly flurazepam, sold under the brand name Dalmane, a powerful sedative that would render victims completely helpless. Her method was chillingly systematic. She set up joint bank accounts with victims or forged signatures to steal disability and social security checks. She collected money long after the victims were dead, sometimes netting thousands of dollars a month. The drugging would incapacitate her victims. She'd slip the sedatives into their food or drinks. While they were deeply unconscious, she would finish them off, likely by smothering them with a pillow. Clean, quiet, efficient. This elaborate web of lies allowed her to operate for years. Multiple years. Multiple victims. All while wearing the mask of a kind old lady who just wanted to help. To understand how someone becomes capable of such calculated evil, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to January 9th, 1929, when Dorothea Helen Gray was born in Redlands, California. Her early life reads like a textbook case of childhood trauma, the kind of experiences that psychologists point to when trying to understand how someone's moral compass can become so profoundly broken. When Dorothea was only 8 years old, her mother died of tuberculosis. 8 years old, still a child. Watching her mother waste away from a disease that was ravaging families across America during that era. But the tragedy didn't end there. Shortly after her mother's death, her father, an alcoholic, also passed away. Within a brief, devastating window of time, young Dorothea lost both parents. With nowhere else to go, she was placed in foster care. And foster care in the 1930s was not the regulated, monitored system we have today. Dorothea suffered neglect and emotional hardship in these placements. She had no stable family support, no one to tell her she mattered, no one to provide the love and security every child desperately needs. These early losses and the lack of a nurturing environment likely influenced her later behavior and worldview in profound ways. I'm not saying this excuses what she did. Nothing could excuse the calculated murder of vulnerable people. But understanding her background helps us understand how someone develops the capacity to see other human beings as nothing more than financial resources to be exploited. As a young woman, Dorothea's life continued to be marked by instability. She married for the first time in 1948, but the marriage ended quickly in divorce. Over the years, she would have several more marriages, all of which ended in separation or divorce. The pattern was clear. She couldn't maintain lasting, genuine human connections. To support herself during these turbulent years, she became involved in prostitution. This lifestyle wasn't just about survival. It exposed her to the darker sides of human nature. It taught her manipulation. It taught her control. It showed her how to read people, how to give them what they wanted to see, how to exploit vulnerabilities. These were skills she would later refine to deadly perfection when selecting and grooming her victims. The transition from her troubled youth to her criminal adulthood wasn't sudden. It was a gradual evolution of someone learning to survive by preying on others' weaknesses. The 1960s and 1970s were crucial decades in Dorothea Puente's evolution, from petty criminal to something far more sinister. These were the years when she laid the groundwork for her deceptive public image, while simultaneously engaging in various crimes that hinted at what was to come. Her early career saw her working as a nurse's aide in Sacramento, California. This job was perfect for her purposes. It allowed her to interact with and deeply understand the vulnerable populations she would later target: the elderly, the mentally disabled, and those dependent on government assistance. This profession provided her with a facade of compassion, while also giving her practical understanding of caregiving, which she expertly leveraged. During this era, Puente began operating boarding houses. Initially, she cultivated a reputation as a compassionate and caring individual. She presented herself as a maternal figure, a respectable older woman who was a genuine resource for the homeless, alcoholics, and those with mental health issues. She would host Alcoholics Anonymous meetings at her properties. She assisted residents in signing up for Social Security benefits. Each action further solidified her image as a community helper. But even as she built this public reputation, Puente had a clear and escalating criminal history. In 1960, she was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 90 days in Sacramento County Jail for operating a bookkeeping firm that was actually a front for a brothel. Not long after her release, She was arrested again, this time for vagrancy, resulting in a second 90-day sentence. These early brushes with the law demonstrated her willingness to engage in illicit activities for financial gain. But more importantly, they showed a pattern. She would commit crimes, receive relatively light sentences, and then continue right back to criminal behavior. The system kept giving her chances, and she kept betraying that trust. The most telling conviction came in 1978. By this time, Puente's main method of financial crime was exploiting her vulnerable tenants. She was convicted of illegally cashing 34 state and federal checks that belonged to people living in her boarding house. 34 checks. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was systematic theft from the most vulnerable people in society. The conviction resulted in 5 years of probation and an order to pay $4,000 in restitution. She was also banned from running a boarding house. But here's the thing about people like Dorothea Puente. Consequences don't deter them. They just make them more careful. This 1978 conviction was a critical precursor to her serial killing spree in the 1980s. She had learned that she could steal from vulnerable people with relatively little punishment. She had learned which types of victims were easiest to exploit. And she had learned that the authorities were slow to notice when society's forgotten people disappeared. The light sentence and ongoing probation did little to stop her. She was setting the stage for something much darker. The year 1982 proved to be pivotal for Dorothea Puente. This was the year that marked what investigators later believed was her first murder, and it was also the year she received a prison sentence that should have ended her criminal career. Should have. In April 1982, Puente's friend and business partner, Ruth Monroe, aged 61, was found dead in Puente's home. The cause of death was attributed to a massive overdose of codeine and acetaminophen, basically Tylenol with codeine. Puente, who was living with Monroe in an upstairs apartment, told authorities that Monroe was distraught and depressed. She suggested her friend had taken her own life. At the time, the police accepted Puente's story without much question. The death was officially ruled a suicide. This was a significant failure in the early investigation, a missed opportunity to stop what was coming. Puente must have felt invincible after successfully deflecting suspicion. Years later, as her other crimes came to light, Monroe's death was re-examined. Investigators took a fresh look at the evidence, the circumstances, the timeline. The death was ultimately reclassified as a homicide, making Ruth Monroe the first identified murder victim in the criminal case against Dorothea Puente. But despite successfully avoiding detection in Monroe's death, Puente's predatory behavior quickly caught up with her through other victims. Later that same year, police were back on her trail. A 74-year-old man named Malcolm Mackenzie accused her of a serious crime. He reported that Puente had drugged him by slipping something into his drink after they met in a bar. This was a technique she had clearly refined. She would target vulnerable or elderly people she encountered in bars, getting them alone, incapacitating them with drugs, and then robbing them. While Mackenzie was unconscious, Puente stole his coin collection, watches, and other valuable jewelry, including a diamond ring. Mackenzie wasn't the only victim willing to come forward. Another incident involved a woman named Dorothy Osborne, where checks and credit cards were stolen. The pattern was unmistakable. These accusations led to Puente's arrest and conviction in August 1982. She was charged with and convicted of 3 counts of theft. The evidence also documented her use of drugs to incapacitate her victims. The court sentenced her to 5 years in state prison. Finally, it seemed, Dorothea Puente's criminal career had been stopped. But even from behind bars, Puente was planning her next move. While serving her sentence, she began corresponding with a 77-year-old retiree from Oregon named Everson Gilmouth. This prison pen-pal relationship would prove fatal for Gilmouth. Puente was cultivating her next victim, setting up her next scheme, even while incarcerated. She was eventually paroled in 1985 after serving only 3 years of her 5-year sentence. 3 years. The system had given her another chance. And Everson Gilmouth would pay for that decision with his life. September 1985. Dorothea Puente walked out of state prison after serving just a portion of her sentence for drugging and robbing elderly people. Her parole came with specific, crucial conditions. She was prohibited from handling other people's social security checks. She was forbidden from working with the elderly. These restrictions were put in place precisely because authorities understood her pattern of victimization. Puente immediately violated every single condition of her parole. Waiting for her at the prison gates was Everson Theodore Gilmouth, the 77-year-old retiree from Oregon she'd been writing to during her incarceration. Gilmouth had been charmed by their correspondence. He believed they had a genuine connection. He was expecting them to marry soon. He had no idea he was picking up a predator. Puente quickly moved in with Gilmouth at the upstairs apartment of the house located at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, the address that would become infamous. She wasted no time reestablishing her boarding house operation on the lower level, directly violating her parole conditions. Her first step in exploiting Gilmouth was opening a joint bank account with him. This gave her direct access to his pension and other funds. Shortly after, she wrote a letter to Gilmouth's sister, falsely informing her that she and Gilmouth were planning to be married on November 2nd. This lie was designed to create a cover story for his inevitable disappearance. In November 1985, Puente hired a handyman named Ismael Flores to install wood paneling in her apartment. After he completed the job, she paid him an extra $800, a generous sum. She also gave him Gilmouth's red 1980 Ford pickup truck, claiming it belonged to a boyfriend who no longer needed it. Then came the chilling request. She asked Flores to build her a large wooden box, 6 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet. Essentially, a box the size of a human body. She claimed she needed it for storing books and other items. Flores, having no reason to suspect anything sinister, built the box as requested. In late November or early December 1985, Puente murdered Everson Gilmouth. She placed his body inside the box she had commissioned, wrapping the remains in plastic bags and a bedsheet. The box was heavy and nailed shut. She then convinced the handyman to help her dispose of it, telling him some story about needing to get rid of old items. The decomposed body was discovered by a fisherman on January 1st, 1986. But it would not be identified as Everson Gilmouth for another 3 years. During those 3 years, Puente continued forging letters to his family, assuring them he was fine. More importantly, she continued to collect his government benefit checks, having successfully eliminated the first victim of her post-prison killing spree. The discovery of that box should have triggered alarm bells. Every detail showed careful planning, but with no identification possible, the case grew cold. Puente had gotten away with murder, and now she was just getting started. From 1986 through 1988, Dorothea Puente's boarding house at 1426 F Street became a grim center of exploitation and death. During these years, while maintaining her warm, grandmotherly image that kept neighbors and authorities unsuspecting, she systematically murdered vulnerable tenants for financial gain. Her selection process was coldly calculated. She sought out tenants who were elderly, mentally disabled, homeless, or struggling with addiction, people whose disappearances would likely go unnoticed because they had no close family or strong social connections. Social workers, still deceived by her reputation, continued referring difficult cases to her. The boarding house itself was part of the deception. It looked welcoming. She cooked meals for her tenants and maintained that well-kept garden with the beautiful roses. To everyone watching, she appeared to be a kind caretaker. Meanwhile, she was blatantly violating her parole conditions by working with the elderly and handling their finances. Let me tell you about some of her victims during these deadly years. In October 1986, a tenant named Leona Carpenter suffered a serious flurazepam overdose and was hospitalized. This should have been a red flag. But Puente was skilled at manipulation. While Carpenter was in the hospital, Puente managed to gain power of attorney over her, giving her legal control to cash Carpenter's government checks. Carpenter eventually returned to live at the boarding house. She disappeared early the next year. Her body would be the first discovered when police began digging in November 1988. Another victim, Betty Mae Palmer, arrived at the boarding house in the fall of 1986. Puente quickly took over Palmer's entire identity. She obtained an ID card with her own photo but Palmer's name. She then changed the mailing address for Palmer's Social Security checks to her own residence. Over the next 2 years, Puente cashed nearly $7,000 in payments meant for Palmer. Betty Mae Palmer's partially dismembered body was discovered buried on Puente's property. When tenants disappeared, Puente had ready excuses. She told social workers and neighbors that the missing individuals had gone to visit family, were traveling, or had simply moved on. Her deceptions were convincing enough to delay suspicion for years. She furthered her deception by forging letters to family members of missing tenants. She sent falsely cheerful notes assuring loved ones that their family members were alive and well, just traveling or visiting elsewhere. This bought her precious time to continue collecting their benefits. Her carefully maintained facade of kindness, combined with her cold, calculating actions behind the scenes, allowed her to carry out multiple murders before law enforcement began to connect the dots. She was running a death house disguised as a haven for the vulnerable. And she was profiting handsomely from it, collecting thousands of dollars each month from the government benefits of people she had murdered and buried in her backyard. The systematic nature of these crimes is what makes Puente's case so particularly chilling. This wasn't passion or rage. It was business. The beginning of the end came with one social worker who refused to accept excuses. Her name was Judy Moyse, and she was dedicated to her clients in a way that ultimately broke this case wide open. In February 1988, Moyse placed a 51-year-old man named Alvaro Montoya, known as Bert, in Puente's care. Montoya had a developmental disability and schizophrenia. He was also experiencing homelessness. When Montoya failed to appear for his regular meetings with Moyse, she grew immediately concerned. This was unusual behavior for him. Puente provided Moyse with inconsistent and contradictory excuses for Montoya's absence. Different stories, changing details. For a social worker who knew her clients well, these inconsistencies heightened suspicion. Moyse promptly filed a missing persons report, and police arrived at Puente's boarding house on November 11, 1988, to investigate. What happened next has become one of the most surreal moments in criminal history. When officers arrived and began looking around the property, they quickly became suspicious of that patch of recently disturbed soil in the yard. When they asked Puente about this area, she remained remarkably calm. She maintained her kindly landlady facade, casually gave them permission to dig, and reportedly shrugged, saying she didn't know what was out there. Then she handed one of the detectives a shovel. Within minutes of beginning excavation, the detective uncovered Leona Carpenter's decomposing body. The discovery transformed 1426 F Street into a full-scale crime scene. Forensic teams descended on the property. Media trucks began arriving. And as detectives became preoccupied with the gruesome task of unearthing further evidence, Dorothea Puente saw an opportunity. Here's the shocking part. Even after the discovery of the first body, police did not immediately place Puente under arrest. She was not yet formally considered a suspect. Incredibly, she was able to request permission to leave the property to run an errand, and the police granted it. On November 12th, Puente, this slight, white-haired woman who looked like everybody's grandmother, simply slipped away from the scene. She immediately fled Sacramento, heading south toward Los Angeles. Her flight finally confirmed police suspicions and triggered a massive manhunt. The subsequent excavation revealed a total of 7 victims buried in her yard. Most were wrapped in sheets or tarps. The body of Alvaro Montoya was among them. The discoveries shocked the nation and cemented Puente's reputation as the House Landlady. Meanwhile, Puente's evasion didn't last long. On November 16th, she was located in Los Angeles. She had been using the alias Donna Johnson and was staying at the Royal Viking Hotel. She had befriended a man named Charles Wilgraves in a bar. Old habits die hard. But Wilgraves recognized her from the intense news coverage and contacted authorities. The woman who had spent years carefully constructing a facade of respectability was now front-page news. The kindly grandmother was revealed as a serial killer, and the public was horrified to learn that social workers had been placing vulnerable people in her care right up until the day of discovery. Dorothea Puente was officially charged with 9 counts of murder. Her boyfriend Everson Gilmuth and 8 of her former tenants. Her trial began in February 1993, nearly 4.5 years after her arrest, and drew national media attention. Due to excessive pretrial coverage in Sacramento, the trial was granted a change of venue and relocated to Monterey, California. The prosecution meticulously presented evidence, arguing that Puente had systematically drugged her most vulnerable tenants with high doses of sedatives, particularly Dalmane, to control and eventually kill them. Her sole motive was financial, to steal and cash their Social Security and government benefit checks. The trial lasted 5 long months. But the case was complicated. The exact cause of death for many victims was difficult to prove due to advanced decomposition. The evidence was largely circumstantial, requiring the jury to piece together a pattern of behavior. The defense argued that the tenants had died of natural causes due to their poor health. They painted Puente as an older woman who merely buried the bodies out of panic rather than malice, afraid of losing her income and boarding house license. After 35 days of deliberation, one of the longest in California history, the jury returned a verdict in August 1993. They found Dorothea Puente guilty of 3 counts of murder: the first-degree murders of Leona Carpenter and Vera Faye Martin, and the second-degree murder of Benjamin Fink. However, they were unable to reach unanimous decisions on the other 6 murder counts. The penalty phase also resulted in a deadlocked jury, legally sparing Puente from the death penalty. In December 1993, she was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Puente was sent to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, where she spent the rest of her days. Despite overwhelming evidence and her convictions, she maintained her innocence throughout her time in prison, claiming her tenants died from natural causes, and she only buried them to keep receiving their rent money. On March 27, 2011, at the age of 82, Dorothea Puente died in prison from natural causes. She never admitted to the murders. She never showed remorse. She took whatever truth she held to her grave. The case of Dorothea Puente is a chilling reminder that predators can hide in plain sight, and that the most vulnerable are often the least protected. 9 confirmed victims trusted the wrong person. Others may never be known. They sought shelter and found betrayal. Remember Leona Carpenter, Betty Mae Palmer, Vera Faye Martin, Benjamin Fink, Alvaro Montoya, Everson Gilmuth, and the quiet lives cut short by someone who seemed harmless. There's more to this story, secrets uncovered during the investigation, and an unsettling twist that changes how we remember the victims. Want the full account? Download the Scoob app now to listen to the extended episode and hear the complete case files. Thank you for listening to Serial Killer Files. I'm Arthur Morgan. Stay safe and stay curious. Listen today.